Brompton Cemetery in London. Where are the ghosts? Come with me and we'll have a look. Could it be the only cemetery without ghosts? Welcome back to the Brac Shop, and I'm Tom from the shop. So welcome back, and today I'm going to take you through Brompton Cemetery in London. It's one of the largest cemeteries in London. And where are the ghosts or the spirits? It's 39 acres, and there are over 205,000 guests, inhabitants. It's a bit like a city in itself, a necropolis. And you'd think there'd be some ghosts or spirits running around. So let me take you through. Now don't forget, if you do enjoy this video, click the like button, subscribe if you haven't subscribed as yet so you don't miss out, and click the bell so you'll always be notified when I do release another video. You'll help the channel and will help to make us grow as well. And share the video with your friends if you think this is of interest as well. Now, Brompton Cemetery, built back in 1840, and was built as one of the 7 cemeteries around London, and they were known as the Magnificent Seven. We had Kensal Green, Highgate, Abney Park, Tower Hamlets, Nunhead, West Norwood, and Brompton in 1840. Now, before there was a cemetery there, and don't forget, in the 1840s, that whole area, you could say, was a bit like the countryside. And what used to be there was actually fields and actually a marketplace as well. And London was just getting so overpopulated in the 1800s. And there was no room to bury many people. And so they decided to actually set up these cemeteries on the outskirts of London, as it was back then, and have these cemeteries. And Brompton was designed by Benjamin Board, who's actually buried in Brompton Cemetery as well. So he designed the chapel there, and in fact it was supposed to have 2 other chapels as well for the other denominations, but due to lack of funds they never actually completed it. But the whole idea of Brompton's was to make it like a cathedral, and it was actually designed on St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And in the original plans, they weren't actually going to have graves in the center part, but of course there are graves, quite a few graves there as well, and it's all kept very nice and tidy. And they also have a whole range of catacombs underneath the structures as well. They were designed as a cheaper alternative to being buried in the ground there. And Brompton Cemetery was in use until 1952. However, in 1992, they reopened it again, and it's now a working cemetery where people can still be buried. So it's not actually completely full yet. And there are such wide spaces available in Brompton Cemetery. In fact, it's used quite a lot for filming as well, because there are overground parts, there are very tidy, clean parts, and also new parts as well. Now, the first person that was buried in Brompton Cemetery was back in 1840, and that was Emma Shaw. She died in childbirth. So she was the first person there. And so you've got graves from the 1840s upwards, right through to the end of the 1800s and right through the 20th century to even today. And here's a grave of a young child, Tom, that passed away back in 1882. And he was 2 years, 10 months. And there's been other famous people buried in Brompton as well. Emma Shaw, the first person to be buried in Brompton Cemetery. Hannah Courtoy, the socialite, buried in her mausoleum, thought of as the time machine or a teleportation device. Joseph Bonomi, the Egyptologist who actually designed the Courtney mausoleum. Chief Lone Wolf, who died while he was on tour with Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, buried in Brompton. And in 1996, his remains were taken back to his ancestral burial grounds in South Dakota. Emmeline Parkhurst, the suffragette and fighter for women's rights. Dr. John Snow, who pioneered with anesthetics and linked cholera to infected water. Sir Samuel Conard, the founder of the Conard Shipping Company. Richard Tauber, the famous Austrian opera singer. William Terrace, the famous actor. And Ernest Thesiger, actor, and probably best known for his portrayal of Dr. Pretorius in The Bride of Frankenstein. But where are the ghosts? There's been a lot of suicides, and we have the Courtoy Time Machine, or the Courtoy Mausoleum. Now, this was built back in the early 1850s. Now, Hannah Courtoy actually passed away in 1849, and there's been a lot of mystery about her. She had 3 daughters by a Mr. Courtoy, and apparently the story goes that she was a housekeeper for him, and he was about 70 when she started having his children. And there's a bit of skepticism whether they were his daughters or not. But anyway, he passed away, and she, cut a long story short, she managed to inherit his money, and she became quite wealthy, and she started socializing and became friends with a Mr. Joseph Bonomi. And he was an Egyptologist, and which was very popular at the time. She was very much influenced by him. And so when she died, she requested Joseph Bonomi to design this tomb, mausoleum, in the style of an Egyptian tomb. Now, there's a lot of mystery around it. Investigating, he worked with a friend who actually built a time machine in the 1850s. And to secure the secrecy of it, they decided to set it up in the cemetery. He actually approached the British military about it, but they didn't seem to be interested in it. And some say it was actually more than a time machine, and more of a teleportation device, a Victorian teleportation device. And there was supposed to have been 5 others set up, like in the other cemeteries. So you could go there and come out on the other side of London. Now, don't forget, this was the 1850s, so this was way ahead of its time, if it was real. But there's a lot of secrecy around it. In fact, over the years, the key to the tomb has been lost. So even the ancestors can't even get in there. But if you hunt around, a lot of the tombs around the cemetery have lost keys. So it's not something new. But maybe it's just publicity. In fact, there was one musician who used it on his album cover, and that's when it really became to be really fascinating for the Courtoy Time Machine. But whether it is a time machine or a time machine where they could transport them back to ancient Egypt or some other time, or just around London as a teleportation machine, Who knows? But there is that mystery surrounding this tomb, this mausoleum. And that is one of the fascinating things about Brompton Cemetery. But where are the ghosts or the spirits? Now, I couldn't see any. And in fact, it's very crowded with living people. You can actually use Brompton Cemetery as a thoroughfare to get from one side to the other because it is so large and saves you time walking around it. And in fact, in the 1840s, there used to be the Kensington Canal, and the idea was to bring the coffins up on the barges up the canals, because in the 1840s, all they had was horse and carriages. Of course, later on, the canal was filled in and was used as a railway line, and it became the West Brompton train station. But for some reason, Brompton Cemetery attracts suicides. There have been countless number of suicides. I don't know why. And a very interesting thing happened to me while I was visiting Brompton as well, which I'll tell you shortly. But why do people get attracted to Brompton Cemetery to kill themselves? Well, going from my notes, in September of 1888, Sarah Granville went to the grave of her parents, and there she consumed 3 bottles of laudanum. Now that's a derivative of opium, which was very popular back then, and she bought the bottles from 3 different chemists, saying she had a toothache, although apparently there was no reports of her ever having a toothache. But she wasn't working, but I think she had a bit of money, so that was she didn't have to work. But I don't know what happened, but she got into a bit of depression, and maybe she missed her parents as well. And she went to the cemetery and consumed this portion of laudanum. In fact, she swallowed about 2,500 drops, which apparently was able to kill 5 people. Naturally, they tried to revive her and they took her to the hospital, but she died later in hospital. Now, going further along to August 1892, it was a strange case of there was Alice and Emily Franklin and 2 other girls that were going to put some flowers on our aunt's grave. And they passed this man with a bag, and they didn't take any notice of him. In fact, they thought he might have been a workman. And it was quite late. It was just before the cemetery was closing, and they put the flowers on the grave and started to leave. And they passed him again, and then in his bag he pulled out a gun and started shooting at them. They ran to the gates and they thought they got away, but Alice actually collapsed at the gate, and she didn't know she had been shot. But they took her to the hospital, and unfortunately, that's where she died. They went back looking for this unknown man, and they found that he had shot himself as well. Another suicide and a murder. And then in May of 1898, there's Frederick James Blake. Now, he'd been a well-to-do solicitor for years, over 35 years. He was 55 at the time. His wife had died for the last 7 years prior. And he ended up in melancholy. So he'd had some money, obviously, so he went around the world. He went through Scotland and Belgium and France and down to Australia and New Zealand and returned back. But and he ended up catching influenza as well, but he survived that. But there was nothing for him left to live anymore. So he went to the grave of his wife in Brompton Cemetery, and that's where he shot himself in the head. Very strange, though, because in the inquest, his brother was there, and he identified the gun as the murder weapon, and said it was his gun because he'd actually kept it as a souvenir from a a friend from his solicitor days when kept it as a souvenir because apparently the friend had fallen into bad times, and so he was a bit down and out, and he used that gun to shoot himself in the head as well. Strange coincidence. You wonder what happened to the gun and the next owner. And then in April of 1908, we have Albert Drudge. It's now one of the caretakers that was actually looking on from a distance. He actually saw Albert Drudge took out a gun and shoot himself. Now, he'd sent a letter to one of his best friends explaining the situation, and also in his pocket there was a letter to his fiancée, which actually, because he was actually going to get married in 3 days. His wife had passed away. He'd served in the Boer War in South Africa as well. But he said just before, well, a few days before, he'd heard his wife saying to come to her. And this is apparently where his wife, Henrietta, back in 1907, is buried, somewhere around here. I couldn't actually find the grave, but as you can see, it's so overgrown that it is here somewhere though. But he obviously missed her because he came here and killed himself. So they'd be together. So, what is it with Brompton Cemetery? Now, quite coincidentally, the day that I came to visit here, across the pathway from Henrietta Drudge's grave, and just a bit further along above one of these raised tombs, was a man lying on it with his hired bicycle. He had a bottle of red wine with him, half drunk, and didn't look any unusual. He could have been tired, having a drink, and having a rest. In fact, it could have been one of his ancestors' graves, for I knew. But what was concerning was that he was surrounded with blister packs of medication. That was a bit of a worry. So as I was walking through the cemetery further up, I did see some of the keepers of the cemetery and told them what I'd seen. In fact, someone else had mentioned it to them as well, and they said they would have a look. Now, when I was leaving the cemetery later that evening, there was an ambulance outside, and they had actually taken him and probably saved his life. So what is it with Brompton Cemetery and the attractions for suicide, even in today's time? But with all these going-ons, where are the ghosts and spirits? Well, it goes back to the usual things that I've been saying and thinking, and it relates to energy. And there you can find this theory a lot, especially in different cultures as well. And I think because the cemetery is opened up and people are easily able to go through it, they can jog in the cemetery and have a look around and come through and rest and contemplate and just use it as a thoroughfare as well. And because there is so many people walking through around, I think it changes the energy. It moves the energy around and away, which is why when you walk through, it just actually doesn't feel like a cemetery like you do find in some places that you walk in and there is a feel. So that's my theory on why there doesn't seem to be any records of any ghosts, or many, or I can't find any, of Brompton Cemetery. So what do you think? Have you got any views about it? Or have you had any strange experiences there? Write your comments below. Let's have a discussion and let's see how many people have experienced these things, and if you've actually been to Brompton Cemetery. Maybe because it's all been cleaned up. And again, that's the change of the energies in the area. So write your comments and let me know. And if you like this episode, you know what to do. Please click the like button. It'll help the channel. And subscribe if you haven't subscribed as yet, so you don't miss out, and press the bell, because I try to get these videos out, but things keep happening. So subscribe and click the bell if you haven't already. And I look forward to seeing you again. So stay well and happy. Happy. It increases the vibration. And well, you don't want to be unwell. So until next time, stay well and happy. And I'll see you then.